No seizure. I actually awoke feeling better. Sometimes fate backs off. More often than not, though, she's simply playing cat and mouse. Hadn't really changed her intentions, just considered some way to enhance the torment by varying and protracting it, including a measure or two of false hope. I felt better physically, but here I was in hell again. First year in prison, I enjoyed such vivid dreams each night, almost always pleasant ones. I would be on vacation with my son, with my students in class, or with other poets and scholars in the great cities of America and Europe. These dreams were so vivid that they were like being there. It was torment to wake up and find out they were just dreams and memories. Here I was, still in prison. Since that first year, my sleep had been almost dreamless. The irony did not escape me that today I would have been ecstatic to have awakened and found that, though I was still inside these walls, the world was back to normal, and the horrors of the last few days had been only a nightmare. But no such luck. The cell was dark except for a dim gray light struggling through the window. I was on the top bunk, Glenn was below, and he was dead. I was not only doomed, I was alone. Not quite. Through the cell wall, I heard a familiar voice call, Glenn. It was our neighbor, Big Joe Rossum. He was about the biggest man I'd ever seen, in girth more than height, but a lot of that weight was muscle and bone. Like many big men, Joe was usually patient and affable. In contrast, his cellie, Lil Pete, was one of the shortest men I'd seen inside, barely 5 feet tall and not emaciated, but with hardly an ounce of fat on him. Pete was quiet and thoughtful. On the days I did go to the yard, Pete would often walk with me. He shared my interest in history and philosophy, and we both delighted in discussing great men and ideas. I regarded Joe and Pete among the few fellow prisoners that I could call friends. Relations had become strained and complicated when our neighbors bought a quart of Glenn's hooch on credit, consumed and apparently enjoyed it, but never paid. Several attempts to obtain payment had met with negative results, and Glenn turned stony toward them. He expected me to do likewise. Hence, even though Joe had called to us several times during the disaster, each time Glenn had refused to respond. He'd made it clear to me that if I responded to Joe in any civil way, Glenn would have regarded it as an act of betrayal. Irrational, but hardly atypical in prison. Glenn, Joe called again. I know I did you wrong. I'm sorry. Joe, I replied, at a loss to put the word subtly. Glenn's dead. Diabetes got him. Professor, what shape are you in? Not good. I'm worn out. How'd you manage this long? Joe asked. You got food and water? Some. Not much left, though. How's Pete? I asked. Joe got very quiet, too quiet. His next question, innocuous in itself, was alarming for the timing and intensity with which he asked it. You're a priest as well as a professor, aren't you? Why? Could you hear my confession and grant me absolution? I don't want to go to hell, Joe asked solemnly. Joe, I have a divinity degree, but I'm not a priest. I was never ordained. You can't grant absolution, he asked. Not canonically, not officially. Why are you worried about hell? Starvation is a bitch and nature is unforgiving, but God is merciful. I do the best I can and figure he'll understand even when I screw up. I waited. Joe's response was protracted. Professor, you don't know what I've done, he stated flatly. I thought I could hear Joe sobbing then. After that, Silence. I called out to him several times, but got no answer. I climbed down from the upper bunk and looked at Glenn, shrouded literally on the lower bunk. I almost envied him. Nevertheless, rest had made me reassess the situation. Where there's life, there's hope. Maybe I could finish Glenn's task and get the door open if I was lucky. But luck hadn't exactly been on my side lately. Perhaps a mustard grain of faith was needed. I offered up a silent prayer and hoped grace was still within reach. I said one for Joe and Pete as well. Sometimes fate, coincidence, and providence arrive at a pivotal moment in one's life, most times unexpected. Rarely do all three collide at a crossroads with such dramatic effect. With my head still bowed, and to my extreme surprise and amazement, I heard the strained grating of metal on metal that was both familiar and terrifying. The door was opening. Of course it wouldn't be doing it so by itself. Someone had to be there, using the crank that staff used when cells had to be opened manually. I leaped to my feet, my heart beating furiously, and felt the pounding of the increased blood flow straining my arteries. Indeed, the door was opening ever so slowly. I swallowed a salivalous gulp and held my faint. Another prayer was offered. Lord, don't let it be one of the predators, referring to the horrendous acts of cruelty I'd witnessed during the first days of our abandonment. I frantically looked around me for anything that might serve as a weapon. I lunged for the TV, but I was too weak to lift it. I grabbed a book. Yes, that's it. A sturdy copy of Moby Dick will surely overpower the most powerful adversary. Should a stout whack in the head fail, perhaps I might read him into a stupor. Worthless cad, I was pitying and berating myself for not being better prepared for such an encounter. I settled for the smallest and potentially most lethal device, the trusty ink pen. Mightier than the sword, and in this case, possibly a lifesaver, were I dexterous enough to be able to jam it into any vital orifice, preferably the eye. I steadied myself and prepared for the worst. The door creaked open wide. Now my breathing completely halted as I stared at the figure in the doorway. It, or he, was just a shadow with a faint light behind. Death comes in many disguises. Mine was vaguely familiar. Professor? Armed with my tiny implement and probably too weak to strike any blow forceful enough to do any harm, I chose a more tactile approach. Perhaps reason and cooperation might confound and confuse my opponent. Yes, absolutely. Words to an educated man are like knives to a lowly killer. I chose mine carefully designed to appeal to his more humane intellectual nature. Huh? I said. Professor, it's me. It's Frankie. Are you all right? Confusion, then recognition, as I began to comprehend that my potential tormentor was actually someone I was familiar with, someone I knew to be one of the more quiet and peaceful prisoners. Frankie, is that you? Yes, Professor, it's me. A weak sputtering of laughter and relief escaped my throat. My cell door opened by a simple prayer, and my rescuer, a peaceful Samaritan. Thank God. Were you writing something? Frankie asked. I looked at him dumbfounded and then realized I was still brandishing my pen. I smiled. Probably the first such expression I'd attempted in weeks. My face felt oddly stretched, and I realized it was because the muscles used for the movement had become atrophied. No, Frankie, There were no words for how I felt. I simply shook my head in relief and gratitude. Frankie looked past me to where Glenn lay. Glenn didn't make it, huh? The diabetes got him, I explained. Are there other survivors? I didn't see any, Frankie answered. seemed oddly disoriented and unsure. We should go, simply stated and oh so very true. Is there any way out of here? I mean, will we be able to get out? Frankie didn't appear unsure when responding to that question. We'll find a way. Grab what you can carry, food if you've got any. You think you can climb? He glanced toward the day room window several feet up from the floor. I'll manage. Did you happen to see what shape the yard clinic is in? I asked. It looked trashed. Why? What do you need? I'm epileptic. I need the lantern to prevent seizures. As I gathered a few clothing items and the scant food that remained, an anticipatory wave of fear passed through me, even with a brief self-reminder of my condition. When a seizure hits, a blockage of the brain's natural electrical flow causes one to be seized by involuntary but irresistible motion. Nervous twitching, jaws biting, the tongue to keep one from swallowing it and choking. Although only lasting moments, the effects linger for days, mainly lethargy, sore muscles, and an extremely sore, swollen tongue. There is a period of unconsciousness, and upon awakening, a brief period of disorientation. Soon, the mind and nerves return to normal operation. How I'd lasted this long without an episode, and how much longer I could manage, I didn't know. I took several long breaths. Professor, you all right? Asked Frankie. Frankie's voice brought me back to the present. It also brought me to the embarrassing realization that while concentrating on my most immediate problem, I had forgotten about my neighbors. At once, I urged Frankie, Big Joe, my neighbor in number 120, Big Joe and Little Pete, I think they're still alive. We got to get them out. Frankie jumped into action and soon ratcheted their cell door open. The look on his face should have stopped me, but I failed to recognize the horror behind it. I understood quickly enough. As I peered into that cell, the cold realization of the unspeakable horror that had been going on right next door became abundantly clear. From the ceiling fixture, by a noosed cord he had made from a sheet, Big Joe hung lifeless. Not an easy task, especially for a big man in a small cell to hang oneself, but Joe had managed. As for Little Pete, he no longer existed either as a living human being or even as a whole body. He had been dismembered and to a large extent devoured. Even in the dim light and deep shadows, I could discern what had to be human femurs, humeri, and other bones on the floor of the cell. The gore was simply too horrible to describe further, and I won't insult one's sensibilities by belaboring the unspeakable in graphic detail. Frankie turned away and whispered, Professor, have you ever read Dante's Inferno? Indeed, I had. In fact, in a normal world, the closest one comes to such horror as we were witnessing is reading about Count Ugolino in Inferno. Former president of the city-state of Pisa, Ugolino was arrested as a traitor for a plot against the government. He and his sons were locked in a cell and simply left there. The sons died of thirst, and the father ate their corpses. Finally, he too starved to death. Of all the tormented figures presented by Dante, none offered a fate more gruesome or heartbreaking than that of Ugolino. Unlike many, prison has made me a more compassionate, less judgmental person. As Frankie urged me to finish collecting my stuff so we could get the hell out of there, I couldn't help uttering silent prayers to the providential God who must still watch over the world in spite of allowing man the free will to destroy it. The first was for being spared the agony of a non-fatal seizure at this time. The second was for the brother who cared enough about me to see that I usually had a large private stock of food in prison, Otherwise, before Glenn's diabetes did him in, I might well have ended up like little Pete. We found a hole in the fence where some others had managed to crawl through. That seemed to indicate that we weren't the only survivors. It was exciting to move in the open spaces again. The uncertainty of not knowing the cause of the devastation which had led to our newfound freedom left an uneasiness that was palpable. Frankie and I exchanged observations and speculations as to the whys and hows. We soon realized that neither of us had answers, and we were concentrating on getting out of the immediate area as quickly as possible. We found a rusty, beat-up old maintenance truck with the keys conveniently hidden in the ashtray. Relief followed the keys and the cab as the engine cranked over and the gas gauge revealed half a tank remaining. We were soon on the road headed toward the nearest town. What we'd find there, we didn't know, nor did we speak of the possibilities. Frankie was especially quiet. I posed the question that had been at the back of my mind the entire time. Frankie, you were out. Why'd you come back? How was it that you came to my rescue? I waited for an answer for several seconds. His response might have seemed flippant or a vain attempt at humor, but his demeanor was serious. A little bird told me, he said. It wasn't so much what Frankie said as much as the way he said it that caught my attention. For the first time, I took a long, hard look at my rescuer. His face was gaunt and weathered with heavy creases around his eyes. His arms were marred with deep wounds and he had blood on his hands. I didn't know why Frankie was in prison. I didn't much care. What I was concerned with was what was he going through internally. As if he sensed my inner dialogue, he broke the silence. How far do you think it is to town, Professor? I thought for a moment. I'd say 5, 6 miles as the crow flies. Frankie got quiet again. He just stared straight ahead at the road, lost inside himself, wrestling with whatever demons he lived with. After what I'd been through and what I'd seen, and thinking about what Frankie must have gone through as well, even though he'd taken it upon himself to assist me in my hour of need, I decided I better keep a close eye on Frankie B. A very close eye. I hoped he would turn out to be all right. On that day, at that moment, hope was all we had.